I will start with Europe, and therefore, inevitably, I will start with the issue of preservation. Now, preservation is a highly artificial term. History happens, history leaves its traces, and I have to say that I prefer history without preservation, history as it happens. These are the kind of famous casts of the cavities that the lava in Pompeii left when it flooded the city. That is for me a very beautiful condition, not so much of preserving history, but of revealing history. This is another similarly beautiful image. It is Chernobyl, which was a school in Chernobyl, which was immediately abandoned, and which also has, it's a scene that hasn't been touched. And for that reason, I think it is also history in its pure form and in its pure state. And ironically, of course, an architect and architecture is always tampering with the evidence, at least. Therefore, this pure state is impossible for us to achieve. This is a shop in Damascus. Maybe the building is 1200 years old. And you can see in the way it kind of behaves is that it's still extremely intensely used, and that this use has been kind of more or less consistent over the centuries, and that there isn't this kind of aspect or this stopping history in its tracks, which is the typical condition of architectural preservation, and which you see here in a store next door, which has been preserved, upgraded. It has air conditioning, as you see above, and it is now no longer dedicated to rough and blatant work, but to kind of refined consumer goods. So that is also an important connection between kind of preservation and consumption. My main irritation with the whole issue of preservation, and the main difficulty of the whole issue of preservation for me, is that what preservation ideally should do is let certain conditions continue to exist. And that's a kind of very minimal definition of what I'm saying. For instance, this image kind of only appeals to very few of you, but nevertheless, I think it is a kind of coincidence of kind of random forces. You see casual planning, you see abandoned consumer goods, and you see kind of tentative technologies. But nevertheless, the way they come together is, in my view, an extremely beautiful moment that I would like to preserve. But as an architect, I don't know a single way or repertoire that would be able to preserve it. When we first became interested in preservation, maybe 5 years ago, we started looking at the kind of first moments that laws of preservation were defined, and what we discovered is that the first one happened in France and the second in England, and that the first one happened very shortly after the French Revolution, and that the second one happened just in the middle of the Industrial Revolution that transformed England. And in a way it is very logical that there is a connection between preservation and revolution, because obviously a revolution changes everything, so it makes the question of what you want to keep quite acute. But then we looked at the moment, and what we discovered is that actually these first times that preservation was actually formally kind of recognized were in the beginning of a wave of modern inventions that in the end defined our current moment. Preservation is, for instance, invented in the same year as the electric battery, in the same year that there is a beginning of photography, in the same year that the revolver is defined. And so what we initially thought that preservation was the opposite of modernity, it can perhaps be kind of read in a more intelligent way as being part of modernity, and that also makes sense because modernity and modernization are in themselves revolutionary movements. And so therefore it makes every sense that preservation is part of that revolution. Preservation as the artificial effort to stop time in its tracks and the artificial rescue of certain events from the course of history. Now, what is almost interesting, almost comical, is that the interval between the present and what was supposed to be preserved is becoming ever shorter. In 1880, it was about 2,000 years. In 1913, it was about 2 centuries. In 1980, it was 30 years. And in 2007, and that is the kind of situation that we are facing now, preservation sometimes happens the moment the building is finished. It has happened already to me a number of times. So what we have to think about preservation, and it's kind of probably a difficult switch, is that what used to be an issue of looking behind you and deciding what to keep is becoming something about in front of you, where you have to decide in advance how to construct things that you eventually want to preserve. So from retrospective, it becomes prospective. Now, there is an enormous amount of organizations committed to preservation, and there is an enormous amount of stuff on the earth already preserved. What you see here is over time the increase distributed over 5 continents of preserved monuments. And what you see here in white is the pipeline of elements that are still about to be preserved. So there is a pressure on preservation as part of our current civilization. There are kind of probably various reasons for it, but I can't enter the reasons. What we discovered when we simply added every single space in the world, each single surface of the world and of the oceans that was supposed to be, that is under some regime of preservation, what we discovered that 12% of the Earth's surface is supposed to be preserved. And that is a kind of stunning kind of statistic. It's more than a kind of small continent. And what that means is that kind of mankind has to kind of face a future in which part of the world is undergoing radical and presumably constantly accelerating change, and the other part is undergoing a kind of artificial stasis, stopped that. And this kind of wrenching movement will have its own implications. What we also discovered, and this is equally alarming statistic, is that if this is the constantly upward curve of Wall Street, and therefore the drive of the market economy, that this is the number. This red line is the number of UNESCO heritage sites, so that there is a kind of complete parallel between the two. And there in the middle you see the third red line, which is the increase in tourism. So there we are in a kind of highly ambiguous world. Wall Street goes up, heritage goes up in the same proportion, and tourism goes up in the same proportion again. And as we know, there is not such an obvious relationship between tourism and heritage. One thing that I think is one of the most pernicious aspects of this dedication to preservation is that we can only show respect today by adopting a pose of preemptive servility. Basically, it used to be that you could show respect through contrast, or that if you admired something, you would make a kind of very strong statement next to it. We have lost that belief, and now when we admire something, we surround it by a kind of vaguely similar, non-threatening substance in such a way that in many cases the kind of similarity itself removes the clarity of what the issue was that needed to be preserved. So that is one thing where preservation, for me, has a very negative, can have a very negative effect. The second thing is that what we preserve is typically preserved for architectural or aesthetic reasons, and rarely for genuinely historical reasons. That is why, for instance, when the two halves of Berlin were reunited, one of the first decisions of the now triumphant West was to destroy the former East German parliament. And so, with no excuse, this space where once one half of Germany was governed was removed and erased from the face of the earth. And therefore, there is a very high degree of moralism and judgment in preservation, which actually is deeply ahistorical, because I find it absurd that if you go to Berlin now, you can no longer look at the political space where one half of the nation was governed misguidedly, of course, in the wrong system, but you can also no longer see the wall that that system erected to protect itself. Therefore, significant historical elements are simply gone, and gone by our generation. So when I started thinking about preservation, as an effort and how you could actually adopt other forms of preservation, I began, for instance, in Beijing, which is a city which changes at an incredible metabolism, and which in the past, at least, certainly has destroyed a lot of its substance. I started to look at Beijing and saw that, for instance, the things in Beijing that are preserved are the historical things, and that therefore insignificant and generic architecture that was, for instance, built in the beginning of Mao is erased without any memory. That, for instance, also spaces where crucial political events took place are also disappeared. So, while the way of life of Beijing, the way Beijing used to be inhabited in a very intimate, low-scale, low-wise, almost Roman-like carpet of housing is also gone. So then I actually started thinking about how we could introduce a different system. And these were obviously polemical steps, but we suggested that you could invent a point grid that would preserve whatever it found on its way, so that later you would be able to reconstruct the previous condition from those preserved points. Whether they were important, unimportant, you would always be able to reconstruct, or you could, for instance, imagine a wedge of preservation that as the city expanded, it would also become wider and wider, and therefore enable you almost like a section to go back in history. So these are simply models, other models of preservation. Now, I want to show you a number of things where ways in which we actually started putting preservation in practice. This is a record of a visit I made with Tom Krantz, then the director of the Guggenheim Museum in Frank Gehry, to the Hermitage in Beijing, when the West was still very vigorous, and when the assumption was that the Guggenheim, the West, was going to help the Hermitage to introduce modern art. This is the Hermitage, an incredible complex of palaces around an incredible square. The revolution broke out here, and one of the additions of the Hermitage will be part of this building, so that the Hermitage at that point was becoming, from a complex of buildings, actually almost an urban quarter. Basically, when the Americans came in, they looked at the inventory. These are all the rooms of the Hermitage, These are all the rooms of the General Staff building, and these are all the walls. What we found is basically one complex of buildings with 1,200 rooms and one complex of buildings with 800 rooms. But when the West looked at how to introduce Western art, the conclusion was there is no space for Western art here, in spite of the 2,000 rooms. We need to create kind of bigger spaces because Western art is big. So I started to look kind of more carefully, and what I found was really interesting. It was a museum, but it was also a historical condition. And as a museum, it was outrageous. At the time, you could see, for instance, the paint was flaking off the walls. Daylight was flooding every space, presumably threatening the artworks. And its most famous painting, Malevich Black, square hung between absurd Russian curtains, under the glare from Western light and barely protected. But nevertheless, the most intense experience of art I've ever felt was exactly this condition. Exactly because there was no white cube, exactly because there was no protection. It felt like unprotected sex almost. The immediacy, which of course was exactly what the artist had intended. So what I also saw is that there were displays in kind of rooms, because there were so many rooms that were in themselves chaotic, kind of 1,000 pieces of porcelain kind of jammed together on a table on wrapping paper. But that still, this gave a kind of overwhelming sense of richness and of abundance. And that also in these contrasts, some of the sculptures were military, others religion, others kind of fairy tales, that in this abundance also incredible contrasts happened. So I decided to adopt the kind of opposite direction and look at the Hermitage and see what you can do with the building without changing it. So what we then developed as an office is that even the neglect of the Hermitage was historical, because it had been neglected by the Soviet army, and that therefore what we ought to try is see whether we could do two things at the same time: extend the museum, use the spaces for displays of elements of their kind of superior direction and treasures, but at the same time maintain the building as it had been left behind by the Soviet period as a kind of record of that period. And so we decided to, and this appealed to the director of the museum, Michael Brodowski. So we became the master planner of the Hermitage on condition that we would not change kind of single architecture, or rather we would not be allowed to add anything. All we could do was eliminate things. So this is one proposal for that kind of elimination. At some point in the building we can propose to eliminate the floors, to create a kind of large entry space, but also again to create a kind of sectional sense of history. And some of the same kind of logic we applied kind of recently in Moscow, where we were asked to do a new settlement for the garage, an art space in Moscow that had to move from its current condition, and where we found a restaurant, a Soviet restaurant built in 1983, not of particular character, but still for me an interesting test. So what we found here was an abandoned ruin again, incredible chaos, dirt, pieces of furniture strewn around and kind of vandalized, a solid building with really groaning under age, but also the kind of typical generosity of Russian architecture with kind of wide open spaces, kind of symmetries, and public space. Because I think that one of the things, the difference between communism and capitalism is that in communism, whatever you think about it, the public is still, public space is still there, as opposed to the situation here. So what we decided to do, there was also a beautiful view, to clad the building in a kind of minimum layer of polycarbonate, kind of many layers, because it's kind of very cold, so that you would kind of see the beautiful outside environment and create a kind of box, but use inside as much as possible the conditions of the found object and temper with it as little as possible. Clean it up, make it usable, make it safe, obviously. But we convince the client to even look at the walls as a kind of given iconography, tiles in different colors, with different graffiti, and see whether we could not use exactly those supposedly distressed environments, again to get a kind of double exposure on one hand of the art, but on the other hand of the history of such a project. And that is what is going to happen. So now I move to the Arab world, and still dealing with the issue of kind of preservation. This is, I'm here in a kind of helicopter and flying over the kind of ruins of Palmyra, and seeing an incredibly kind of rare site, namely a superb archaeological site exposed without any limits and without any artificiality. It's kind of simply the way it was. Of course, some of the columns have been kind of combined, but there is no tourism and there is no invasion of the everyday life. So also an extremely interesting test or effort, whether this kind of purity, which if you stand there is really breathtaking in its immediacy and in its kind of contact with an earlier civilization, whole fields of columns that are kind of fragmented, whether the purity of this could in any way be preserved. It was something that came to nothing, but where, for instance, in a kind of similar project we did in the Libyan desert, where we were looking whether this desert, which again is a very beautiful environment, which also comprises a number of very unique historical caves, and in the caves art and kind of records of earlier civilization, which again is completely pure and untampered with, but of course severely in danger of the kind of crude and brutal tourism that is emerging there. So the problem of tourism, of course, today is that it's always the left that kind of reads tourism as a kind of resort, and if possible, near a significant place, but then of a scale that makes its significance disappear, and where we were looking whether a kind of small-scale effort, or a kind of more adventurous effort, or a more onerous effort would perhaps be a way of kind of organizing tourism. Sorry, I see that. I was talking, sorry. These are preservation projects, and I want to kind of show a project which is kind of in a way between preservation and architecture. And I choose my words carefully. I, of course, am an architect, and therefore, of course, I do architecture, but I try to do architecture only when necessary, because I know that architecture in itself has a number of kind of almost brutal implications that non-architecture could hopefully avoid. So here is a poor country that has many treasures, and those treasures need to be both exposed and kind of protected. But if you would simply adopt the kind of modern strategy, you would ask a number of architects to do competitions. Half of those competitions would be kind of pure and elegant boxes. The other half would be pure and elegant blobs. But kind of only none of them would be particularly intelligent about the kind of contents of the museum. So what we try to do here is to incorporate or include the kind of poverty or kind of relative unsophistication of the environment and see whether we could not do a museum that was basically based on a kind of single pixel. That pixel could be a kind of 4 by 4 by 4 meter, 12 by 12 feet cube. And that cube could be a platform, a vitrine, a space, an interior space, or a staircase. And basically, on the basis of one kind of single module, that could be bought almost kind of one by one, and that could also be kind of almost open air. We could create kind of large. We were part of a radical transformation. It was kind of supposed that it is a building in the central district, business district of Beijing, a collection of 300 to 400 skyscrapers. For that reason, it was very important to try two things. To do something that did not compete in terms of height, and also something that, a building that could be interpreted as a kind of polemic with the skyscraper itself. But the problem with the skyscraper is that it simply takes inside and extrudes it and then consumes it. And what we are trying to do here is to create something more different, namely a building that also articulated a space in the city which it itself didn't absorb or consume. So therefore, you see here that kind of around the building or underneath the building there is a kind of public space that in that sense makes it a kind of anti-skyscraper. I insisted yesterday on one of its qualities, and for me an important quality to have introduced in the environment and landscape of Beijing. A building that is unstable in its identity, a building that has almost as many identities as there are movements in the city. And I showed a kind of sequence where this radical transformation of the building is evident. What I didn't have time to show you today is the interior of the building. Because it's very rare in China that an architect also has an opportunity to kind of work on the interior. It is a vast interior. The building is about 5 million square feet, almost like a city. And so here you have a number of glimpses of the kind of building's interior, where one thing that you will see, which again for me is a specific architectural quality, which privately I almost think of as Roman, is a consistent and pervasive presence of structure in every part of the building that really gives it a kind of scale, but also gives it almost a kind of cohabitation between human beings and structure, almost a sculptural nature. So here you have a glimpse of the lobby itself, some of the materials, some kind of windows looking in particular parts of the structure. The structure, as you can imagine, the building is not very easy to support. So the part of the overhang where two buildings come together is an enormous amount of structure. That is also the part where the kind of public can come and look over the city. So we use that density of structure for and make it public. Here you see it. And in that kind of space there are also windows that enable you to look down on the building and on the kind of space suspended in the air. The structure that in some parts of the building is very dense, in others not, and that kind of goes in all kinds of directions. This is, for instance, one of my favorite places where the sculpture almost has a kind of artistic presence, creating also within the building, almost the opposite of kind of repetition and kind of deliberate discontinuity, which makes it possible to digest the enormous amount of interior space that the building contains. Here it's kind of finally ending with the canteen on the top of the building. The second thing I mentioned yesterday is that the building, and it's kind of partly by the irregularity of the grid, which is drawn on its facade, but also by the fact that none of the spaces is really orthogonal. None of the forms is really orthogonal. The building has an ability to connect with almost any element in the city and to somehow create a kind of strange familiarity. I showed this one yesterday, but here you see that there is a kind of almost natural compatibility with the typical hovel that surrounds it, or the kind of chaotic ensemble of 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s architecture that now makes the nature of Beijing. Beijing is also a city which is either incredibly clear or completely misty, and that was also, as architects, an important thing that we considered, how to make a shape that also works in the fog, and in the fog the kind of different planes of the building, of course, have a strong appeal in here. You see it on the skyline, also seamlessly, not so much merging, but becoming part of the Chinese landscape. I want to end, because I also want to give time for questions. I want to end with a project we're currently doing in Taipei, which is really perhaps our architectural manifesto of what architecture can do, and it is particularly a manifesto for me that we should not be lazy when we are confronted with a particular question, and when we are asked to create a building that accommodates a particular program. The architect should not be lazy in terms of what he can do more with that program than the client ever imagined. That is the point of this particular building. Taipei has an incredible nightlife. I don't know exactly why, but it is a city where people go to bed latest in the world, to speak the least. The site of the building is exactly in the center of this nightlife. This is a night market, kind of very famous, with here an enormous platform, an underneath platform, incredible proliferation of restaurants. This is a typical image. I love markets. Markets are the most ancient and the most modern way of interaction. And this is a very robust and exciting market. The food is also very intense. You see the kind of text. And this is the typical way in which the contemporary architect deals with the issue that we were dealing with. We needed to make it a building for 3 theaters, and this is what typically happens. One auditorium with a stage and all the paraphernalia of the stage, a second auditorium with all the paraphernalia, and then a third auditorium, and all brought together in a single envelope, but without any interaction or any interference of one theater with the other. So, but ironically, the typical modern theater is a repetition of 3 times the 19th century model. One of the dishes I saw in this kind of restaurant was actually a pan in which you could cook 3 dishes at the same time. That gives us a kind of radically different idea. And what we could do perhaps is do a theater where all the theater and stage spaces were contained in a single tower, almost a kind of super tower in which all the stage technology was placed, where the auditoriums kind of emerged from different sides. So the idea was that rather than make each of them separate, it would be interesting to jam them together and to create a single entity. And in addition, we thought it would be a kind of real pity to remove the market. So the building is kind of simply stage tower is placed simply on the market, so that kind of basically you seamlessly go from the market through the market into the building. So the building deliberately declares itself part of the nightlife as a form of continuity. What we also wanted to achieve is that even for people that are not able to go to the theater or don't want to go to the theater or cannot afford to go to the theater, there would be a path that took you through this kind of combined theatrical spaces, so that you could be confronted in a real way with what is actually incredibly exciting about many cultural spaces that rarely revealed, the sheer amount of hard work that goes into performance. So in this case, for anyone who wants to, there is a separate entrance and a kind of separate path that takes them kind of past performances that are ongoing through archives, through technical spaces, even kind of able to witness performances that are going on behind the kind of sound-proof space. You can comment on it as you look, and then kind of emerge on the roof. And what I finally want to show, where I want to end this kind of brief journey past a number of different strategies, kind of each applied and each inspired by the specific economics of their respective situations, and therefore each kind of mobilizing perhaps different parts of the architectural brain, is the advantage of this kind of consolidation of technical space in a single entity. Here you see the stage tower and the kind of emerging auditoriums. What is actually possible here is that the auditoriums are coupled, that you create an enormous theatrical space on the inside, and that you therefore create in the inside spaces as big as the industrial spaces where many theater makers prefer to work, rather than in the kind of contained and constrained environments of the traditional theater. So here you see the kind of enormity of theater that is possible in here, almost like a kind of factory inside an otherwise classical theater, where this performance, which requires a 120-meter, 360 feet stage, can be performed between these two theaters. So for me, this is kind of really a representation of architecture, which is on the one hand scrupulous in terms of responding to program, in terms of answering precisely what the client demands, but at the same time finding in those ingredients possibilities of other combinations and unexpected transformations that simply offer an enormous amount of additional potential to deploy either life or creativity. And I find architecture at this moment surprisingly narrow in exactly this kind of additional. It's not a form of questioning, it is actually more a form of providing what has not been asked for. Thank you. So I propose that we can now have questions if there are. Thank you.